The Grand Bay Jane Doe, identified as Ada Elizabeth Fritz. Some kids were fishing in a creek underneath Potter Tract Road, which is south of Grand Bay, Alabama. One of the kids would comment about it as an adult, saying his friend stopped by and wanted to go fishing, so they went down to the same area of the creek that they always did. They would see what they thought was garbage, saying it had been thrown over the bridge, and like normal curious boys, they found themselves prodding at it with sticks, trying to figure out what it was. At this point, they would see a limb, but at this time, like many people before them, they would think it was a mannequin. And as a wise commenter said in one of my videos, it's never actually a mannequin. Some of these poor boys realized that they dragged the contents out of the creek and that it was a real person, saying they got the heck out of there and ran to their parents the moment they realized that this was something serious. One of those boys would speak out later on, saying he was 14 and it still freaks him out. And at the time, he couldn't sleep alone or with the lights off. I think it's easy to forget that in a lot of these cases, younger people find the remains. In their own way, they're an additional victim of whatever happened. The police would say that it was clear the perpetrator did everything they could to keep her from being identified. Her hands had been removed, as had her dentures. There was a plastic bag on her head and her arms. They believed that she'd been transported to where she was dumped, and this was done to try to keep trace evidence out of the car. She was the victim of a gunshot taken there in a car and not a truck. They believed she was between 50 and 65, and the police would comment that it was shocking, saying she was probably someone's mother or grandmother, that it's not an age they expect to run into, and that it was especially surprising when no one came forward to identify her. Nearly 20 years would pass before there was any sort of a break. At this time, a woman was found in the pond near the Alabama-Mississippi line. It would mimic our Jane Doe's scene. Her dentures and hands had been removed, and in that case, they caught who was responsible. I wish I had a photo of Irma to show, as she deserves recognition too, but all I know is that Irma Williams had her life taken in Moss Point, Mississippi, and it was determined that the person who did this was her own son, a shipyard worker named Henderson James Williams. I barely found a photo of the son. Henderson Williams definitely deserves to spend the rest of his life in prison. He would go on and refuse to address his link to the other unidentified Jane Doe, and he passed away in prison without ever saying what happened or identifying the other woman. What seems sort of bizarre to me too is he was never going to get out. That was determined by his sentence, and still he couldn't even find it in himself to give this woman back her name and explain what happened. But they do believe he's the one who did this. He lived 20 years after our Jane Doe passed before taking his mother's life. He was convicted in 1996, and he would go on to live 12 years in prison before passing away there, meaning that he spent 32 years on Earth after our Jane Doe's life was taken. But it's just amazing how someone could live with that and not even try to do right in the end. But he was definitely not a good guy. His mother was 94 years old when he took her life, and he reportedly did it because he wanted access to her bank account and she had refused. He apparently wanted her Social Security checks. The biggest issue in identifying our own decedent here is the fact that they cremated her. Thankfully, in most of the cases, this was not done, but they had no idea then that DNA would actually provide answers later on. So sadly, some of these people lost their chance to be identified. But there was a little bit of a twist here. The police would at one point declare at the end of the road, saying any work needed DNA, and that's lost with cremation. There were no dentals because she had no teeth. They didn't have fingerprints because they had no hands. But then something pretty amazing happened. The officer was looking into the cold case, made a discovery that he thought out of the box with. Investigators in 1976 had actually made a cast of our Jane Doe's mouth, and they had kept it in a box. Even though they didn't have her dentures, they'd hoped that that cast might make a difference at some point. And it did, just not in the way that they expected. Moxie Forensics was able to take that cast of her mouth and isolate usable DNA. So huge props to Detective Thornton in Grand Bay, Alabama, for thinking outside of the box, as well as to Moxie Forensics for many of the identifications that just happened. Investigator Thornton told the press that they needed some kind of physical evidence to tie him to her crime, and that was impossible, due to what he described as the lapse of time and the government's inability to maintain records for extended periods, which makes me think he was pretty frustrated also. He would say that he didn't think they'd get usable DNA, but he was so excited to the possibility, saying it was all meant to be, and he was thankful that his pessimism went unrewarded. They would call it a scientific miracle. The DNA would eventually lead to a cousin that was pretty far down the line, going back 7 generations. But unlike a lot of the stories where this happens, that cousin was described as knowing people. She was able to track down one of her nephews who had a photograph that would eventually be used to help identify this person. Obviously, as time goes by, a lot of the living people that could identify him also pass. So it gets really hard to make the identification. So this was pretty miraculous in its own way, how all of this went. This nephew would mention that his aunt, Ada Elizabeth Fritz, was 61 in 1976 when she went missing. He would say that she went missing from Batesville, Arkansas. Batesville is about 519 miles, or 836 kilometers, away from where she was found, in Grand Bay, Alabama, which back then was an entirely different world when it came to making identifications. So it might as well have been halfway across the United States. He would say that Ada Fritz lived for many years in Oregon, and she would marry twice. Her last husband was pretty abusive to her, and she chose to leave the area when she finally got away from him, traveling to the Gulf Coast for a fishing trip. It's suspected that it was at this time that Ada came across Henderson Williams. By this point, Williams was already long known to be a pretty bad guy, too. Had the system looked out for those around Williams, his mother and Ada would have most likely lived naturally long lives. Because it turns out that in 1973, Williams was convicted of his first of the 3 lives we believe he took. It's not clear why he was let out, but he served only 28 days in that case, after a conviction in Newport News, Virginia. We also know now that one of Ada's friends actually suspected that she was the Jane Doe. This woman was named Franny Mae Gaunt, and her name appears inside of the notes on Ada's case. She came forward saying she thought that the Jane Doe was her friend Ada. It's unclear why they never followed up or tried to confirm this. In a sad twist of fate, Franny Mae Gaunt herself became a victim of someone else, her life being taken only 2 years later. And in her case, it's still cold and unsolved. We know now that Ada was born in Sheridan, Wyoming in 1914. And in the case of Ada, he went to a lot of effort to wipe her identity away, and he won. And that always seems pretty unforgivable. Her nephew, who is now in his 70s, would say that the aunt who'd been so kind to him as a child had needed to get away and start over. And he knows for sure that 48 days before her remains were found, she had been living in Batesville, Arkansas. She had barely moved there right before this happened. When he was young, he used to spend his summers with his Aunt Ada. They even went hunting together. Ada Elizabeth Fritz was born 109 years ago, and she was a Jane Doe for 47 years. Thank you everyone so much for watching and listening. If you aren't subscribed, please take a moment to do so, hitting the bell so you are notified of new videos. And thank you all for leaving comments and emojis to help with engagement, as well as hitting the like button. Take care of yourselves and each other.